Thank you very much. So sustainable materialism sounds somewhat paradoxical, and I'm probably a living example of that paradox, because as Elspeth said, I've actually stopped off in Las Vegas for 5 hours to meet with a seafood distributor to talk about sustainable seafood in probably the most unsustainable city in the entire world. So, as Elspeth had said in the introduction, I work for Ecotrust Canada, which is an environmental nonprofit based in Vancouver, Canada, although I'm out in the eastern side of Canada, in Ottawa. And the purpose of our organization is to build the conservation economy. And that's an economy that sort of integrates social and environmental ecological values into the production of goods and services. So we work very practically with a lot of First Nations, small businesses, rural communities on the coast, helping to actually make businesses financially feasible and to produce goods and services for our society. So my angle, my sort of perspective is one from a very practical small business community perspective. And at Ecotrust Canada, we work primarily in the resource sector, in fisheries, in forestry, in renewable energy, and with a lot of rural communities, as I said. And we've done a lot of work in what I would say is sustainable materialism. And if you ask what is it, I think there are two sort of components to the answer to the question, what is sustainable materialism? And one of them is quantitative. So, it really doesn't matter how eco-certified or organic your beer is. If you drink too much beer, you're going to become an alcoholic, and you're going to have all sorts of associated health problems. So part of the answer to what is sustainable materialism is about quantity. It's about consumption, how much we're all consuming and how much we all need. And there's a lot of economists and sociologists that are starting to look at sort of diminishing returns of our material advancement. We can get more and more wealth, more and more material goods, but that's just not making us any happier. In fact, there's lots of data that shows that we're becoming unhappier as a society. And there's new metrics out there, such as the gross national happiness, as well as the genuine progress indicator, sort of new metrics for us to measure exactly what sustainable materialism is. The other question, the other component or other question is, what do we value? What are the qualities of the goods and services that we as a society value? And we think of Western civilization as materialistic, and we all kind of know what that means. But yet, we live in a disposable culture. I would say that we really aren't materialistic because we actually put very little value in the material objects that we consume on a day-to-day basis. We buy things that we don't need. We buy things that don't last. I wouldn't call that materialistic. It's people that actually have very little respect for the material objects that they actually buy. I'll go so far that in Western society today, many of us don't even understand what a quality good is. We have to default to brands, Gucci or Versace and these sort of things, because we can't actually identify good craftsmanship. So we have to use these things, brands, to sort of be a shorthand for what quality is. So for most of my talk tonight, I want to just touch on sort of a short history of stuff, because I think it's relevant to understand where we've come as a species, to understand where we're going and what sustainable materialism really is. And in ancient times and prehistoric times, consumers and producers were intimately linked. I mean, you typically knew the person that you purchased a good from or traded with. And there were two things that really drove human progress. Evolutionary biologists have looked at these two things. And the one is reciprocity. So that through repeated transactions, we get cooperation amongst human beings. The second is, even if there isn't repeated transactions between two people, people talk. And so we have this thing called reputation. So you don't try to rip off the person you're trading with because you know that person might tell somebody else, and then your reputation will be shot. These two things, reciprocity and reputation, has driven human beings to become the most cooperative and social species on the planet. And I think we all have to remember that, because I think that's relevant to our modern times today, because I think that our fundamental human nature can help drive a new sort of sustainable materialism. So, of course, as humans progressed, we increasingly became disconnected from the producers, from the people creating our material goods. In the age of the Enlightenment, the age of exploration, with the advent of European empires, we started to build global commodities, global commodity markets. Canada, before it was even a country, was actually a big corporation. It was called the Hudson's Bay Corporation, and it had a royal charter to exploit the commodities of British North America. And increasingly, we became disconnected until we came into the 20th century, and there was a new twist on this disconnection with the introduction of mass production and also mass marketing. And that became particularly true after the Second World War. Consumers, again, became out of touch from the actual producers, and we started to become and develop relationships with brands, with things like the Marlboro Man, Betty Crocker, McDonald's. We started to identify with brands. By the 60s and 70s, though, with the advent of the environmental movement and social movements in North America and around the world, a lot of people increasingly became suspicious of large corporations and even large governments. And we started to, but at the same time, by the time the 90s came along, our global supply chains have even become more disconnected. The very brands that we sort of put values in and developed relationships with became virtual. Companies started outsourcing. Very brands like Apple or Nike didn't even own the production facilities of the material goods they were creating. There was even a greater disconnect. But at the same time, there was also more criticism on this sort of virtual brands and this globalization. Canadian writer like Naomi Klein with No Logo, or the Vancouver-based publication Adbusters, started going after these brands that were sort of putting up sort of phantom or false images of what they were really about. So consumers started to lose trust in trademarks. So then we have the advent of something new, and that's the trust mark. And that was the 1990s with the advent of eco-logos. So in the last 15 or 20 years, we've seen just a huge explosion in eco-logos that are supposed to be shorthand for what's sustainable. We have the Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, LEED for green buildings, fair trade, organic. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Some of the best eco-labels have independent assessments, standards and metrics. Others, many people consider as greenwashing. And it's because of this sort of lack of trust that we have in brands, we've now created sort of new brands, these trust marks. And even now, with the explosion of trust marks, there's lots of criticism around whether these are really quantifying what sustainable materialism is or what sustainability is. Lots of criticism of MSC and FSC. And Ecotrust Canada has been very much involved in pushing the Forest Stewardship Council in Canada. We've been one of the main proponents on the West Coast, so we've been very much involved in it. So this brings us to today. And Ecotrust Canada, we're now sort of experimenting. We're exploring new ways to use information technology and material traceability to bring about a sort of sustainable materialism. And what we've done actually is we've married information technology and traceability to create a global, scalable seafood traceability system that allows the consumer to connect right back to the harvester who caught their fish. And we're also starting a startup around forest products as well around this traceability. And I call it actually not traceability, but faceability. It's about putting a face on the seafood that you eat and developing those relationships, those reciprocal relationships with the producers that can often be thousands of miles away. Even in Canada, we're a large country just like Australia. So I just want to end by talking about a sort of tragic story this morning that I saw in the news that I think most of you are aware of. And that's and it's a story actually about traceability and sustainable or unsustainable materialism. And that's the death of the Bangladeshi textile workers. When I got into the hotel this morning, there was a news story, and it showed images of people taking charred bodies out. And reporters were asked what companies were making products there. So they started rummaging through the debris, and they saw products that were made by Disney, by Walmart. Disney, of course, put out a press release denying that they had produced any materials or any goods in the factory for 12 months. But they were very concerned about their reputation. And I think by using new information technology and social media, if we can bring a new transparency to supply chains and connect people in distant markets, we can use these old ideas, these old concepts of reciprocity and reputation to really drive for a sustainable materialism that really humanizes our supply chains that have really become dehumanized over the last 2,000 years. Thanks.